Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 650. Today I'm going to talk about a book. This is a new miniature gaming rule set from Warlord Games called Warlords of something. Now it's actually nowhere spelled backwards, so I'm going to say Warlords of Erehwon, or Warlords of Nowhere. So it's a kind of a bolt action system, which I've been super interested in trying. Now bolt action is a World War II miniature gaming system, which I'm not super interested in playing a World War II miniature game. Mostly because I mostly have fantasy and sci-fi miniatures. I don't feel like collecting World War II miniatures. I would play World War II miniature, I just don't have the desire to get the miniatures. So this is a fantasy game. And what the bolt action system is you have a bag or a cup or something, and you put different colored faction dice that are bolt action dice. They're special, unique dice. And on your turn, you draw a die out of the bag. And if it was white is your color and black is my color, then you take the die out and it's my turn, or whoever's turn it is, and then you assign the die. There's a bunch of little orders written on the die, which I'll show you, and then you activate your unit. So it's a back and forth. I could go 2 or 3 times in a row, or Billy could go 4 times in a row, or we can go back and forth a whole bunch. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but the reason I'm interested in that is because I've liked games from Lock and Load and others, which are chit pull, where you have maybe like a World War II game and you pull chits out of a bag or out of a stack and then you activate it in a similar way. And I've really enjoyed that in kind of a war game, board game format. So I've been super excited to try this, and I've had a lot of people recommend bolt action. You got to try bolt action. So now they've come out with a fantasy version of bolt action, and the designer is Rick Priestley, who did like the original Warhammer and 40K and Necromunda and all that stuff. So there's a little bit of pedigree involved as well. But anyway, so let's jump in and take a look at some of the mechanics, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the book. Then I'll come back and tell you what I think. Everything that you need to play the game is right here in front of you. Of course, in addition to miniatures and terrain and all that kind of fun stuff. You want, of course, the rule book, which is only in hardback right now. They are coming out with it in PDF. And most importantly here, you want some bolt action dice. Now, you don't have to use these custom dice, but you'll want at least D6s in 2 different colors. And then if you want to say, let's say down or ambush or whatever is a certain number, then you could just put normal D6s in there. Because what you're going to do is you're going to draw these out of a bag, so you need a bag or a cup or something, and then you're going to assign that die to a unit, and that will stay there. And whatever the unit, the order that you assign to it is kind of persistent, so you need to keep track of what you assign things and so on. So it is handy. I would definitely recommend getting these dice so that you can remember, oh, I assigned them an ambush or a fire or a run or something. Now you're also going to need a bunch of D10s, and it's good to have some in different colors. You don't need as many different colors as I have here. Probably one color, then a couple of different ones, because as you sort of assign damage, you might need to roll differently for different things. But just some D10s. And then I found some D6s to kind of just mark wounds and pins and things, or you can get whatever tokens you want and stuff, but these are also handy to have for that. And then a measuring device, obviously, and then this you may or may not need depending on the type of unit that you have. But there is sort of like on artillery or a throwing, like some giants might throw rocks, and you'll use a 3-inch template to sort of measure that, and if it kind of misses, then it may move in a direction and hit some other unit or something. But this is maybe handy to have as well. So I have just set out a group of different units here, and you can see, hey, I've got some that are in square bases, and I've got others that are in round bases. It doesn't really matter for this game. The rules say it doesn't matter, and in practice it doesn't really matter at all. And I have not rebased my ogres yet, so I can use them. And it's pointed out, just like many games, I've tried 500-point games and 1,000-point games. Definitely 500-point games are not really worth playing, in my opinion. The 1,000-point games, the rules say, is kind of like your normal format, all the way up to 2,000 for like a really large game. I haven't tried that, but a 1,000-point game definitely feels right at home. I wouldn't really even fool around with a 500-point game, except maybe just to kind of learn the mechanics and stuff. Now it is somewhat crunchy and dense of a rule set. You can see the book's pretty thick. I would not let this intimidate you too much. There's definitely like scenarios and army lists and stuff like that. So if we go up to here, that's all scenarios. And so this is, that front half of the book is pretty exhaustive. There's spells and terrain and a lot of stuff like that you may or may not use in your first couple of games. But this is definitely a little bit more on the crunchy end for these large Earth scale battles. This isn't like a Warhammer Fantasy where you're going to have like hundreds and hundreds of models. It's more at the Age of Sigmar skirmish level, but a little bit on the lighter end of that even in terms of the number of models and things that you get out. I haven't gone through every sort of unit in the book, but the most that I've seen is a unit of 10 models. Like I was playing with my zombies and I had a bunch of units of zombies, each at 10 models, but there's no like blob of 40 models or anything like that. So let's kind of quickly go over the kind of the basics of the bolt action system. Like I said, you draw out of a bag, and then let's say the ogres here are white and the undead over here is black. So we draw one out, we get a black die, and then we're going to assign it a different order. So you've got down, run, advance, and so on. So a very simple one would be to fire, and these guys don't really have any ranged weapons, but let's pretend they do. So if you fire, assign a fire order, then based on what weapons you may have assigned to them, you're going to measure out, and then you're going to measure from the closest model in this unit to your target unit. Most stuff is like 10, 20, maybe even 30 for extra long range. And then you're going to roll a number of d10s per model in there, and sometimes they have multiple attacks, so maybe they'll do 2 attacks each. And then they have a target number. So the one nice thing is Battle Scribe, which is an online tool, has an army builder for it, so it makes building armies pretty easy. So when you shoot, you're going to look at accuracy. So you can see this particular unit has accuracy of 5. And so what you're trying to do is roll 5 or less, okay? And so you're going to roll that, and then you sometimes will get re-rolls, and you can re-roll anything that's over, but anytime you roll a 10, you can never re-roll that, and that's persistent throughout the entire game. So I'm going to assign a bunch of hits with my fire order. Now, if you do a fire order, you get to add +1 to your stat. So in that case, we had a 5, it would go up to a 6, and then you would roll that, and all you have to do is get under a 6. So you're never really modifying the dice in this game. You're modifying the stat, and then trying to get equal to or less than that stat. Now, let's say we got 3 hits out of that, and then these folks here will roll their resilience stat. And the resilience here, you can see, is normally a 5, but I equipped this particular unit with some armor, which bumps it up to a 6. And this is just the way of Battle Scribe telling me that. So they try to roll as 6 or under, and then anything that they don't block will then cause a wound on that unit. But before you roll this, you actually want to effectively assign those hits to each model, because a lot of the units will have like a leader model, and they'll have the tough ability, which allows them to re-roll a missed resilience roll. So, and the reason you want to keep your leader around is because they have a higher command. So you may or may not do that. You may say, oh, okay, my leader's this guy in the back. I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and roll these together and then resolve that. I found that it doesn't really matter too much, like, oh, which one did you remove or whatever. You just roll 3 and then pick the 3 you want. That's a quick and easy way to do it. So anybody that misses the resilience, you're then going to pull them off. Or if they have, sometimes they'll have a wound thing, and so they'll get multiple wounds, will be required to pull a model off. Most of the time, no. But anytime you get a hit, you're going to put a pin on that unit that was targeted. And that even happens even if they fail all of their resistance rolls. So one thing that you might do is sort of pepper these units with ranged attack to add pins, because pins is bad. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So anyway, that's the fire. Now the advance is similar, so you can advance up to your movement and fire, but you don't get the +1 if you do an advance. And movement for everything, typically 5 inches. So everything moves 5, unless it has a special ability that says it's fast. If it says fast, it'll say like fast 8, which this particular cavalry unit is, which means their movement is 8. The base movement is 5, so when you advance, you can move up to your, whatever your movement is, 5 or 8 or whatever. So let's move them up. And then you can, if you want, make a shooting attack after an advance. Now there are some units that cannot do a shooting attack on the advance. It'll tell you in the rule book that, like artillery units and certain monsters and stuff, can only be shot with a fire, or like a heavy crossbow that takes a long time to reload. There's no way you could be moving and firing it. Whereas something like maybe a regular bow, you could be walking up or running up and shooting your bow out. So that's fire in advance. And the other thing you might have is, let's find it, is run here. And then when you run, you can move up to 2 of your movement. So again, everybody has a base of 5. So all of these guys over here can move up to 10. If you do run, you can do two movements. You can also try for a sprint. Oh, and I should say, since these guys are fast 8, they could do 2 8, so they could do 16. You can also try a sprint when you do a run to move a 3rd movement. But if you do that, you're going to roll against your agility here. You can see that's a 5. And so something big and clumsy like this mammoth here, you know, maybe they don't have the greatest agility. Most stuff has 5. So when you do a run and then you want to do a sprint, you're going to roll against your agility. We got a 4 there, so we're okay. But let's say we failed it with a 10. If you fail your agility, you're still going to move that 3 movement across the board, but you're going to take a pin, which again is bad. So we should probably talk about pins. Now, normally when you start the game, nobody's got pins. So you can assign orders left and right as you wish. But once you start to take pins, you're going to have to test to see if kind of the morale of that unit is up to snuff. So you're then going to roll here. So we got a 4, and we're going to compare that to our unit's command, which in this case is 7. But you're going to reduce that by 1 for each pin. So if you start to stack up pins, let's say you got 4 pins on you. So your command there is 7, but let's say you have your chieftain in that group is 8. So it'd be 8 minus 4, so we would have just made it here with that 4. And then what happens is, if you assign that order and you fail it, then you fail. You don't get to do anything, and you've wasted that, and that unit's just kind of stuck, and they're sort of just, they have to be actually assigned a down marker, which means they're just down and not doing anything. And then at the end of the turn, for everybody that's down, you've got to do that command test again. So maybe they've taken some more pins, and you know, there's going to be even harder for them to get up off the rear end and get going. And there's another little factor with pins, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's, let's see, fire, run, ambush, and down. Down will also modify certain things. So if you get charged and shot at and stuff, there might be different things. Now there's another little bit here to do with run, and that's actually charging and getting a unit into combat. We're going to put that on pause for a second. I want to talk about the last 2 things here. One thing you can do is you can ambush. So you just mark the unit as ambush and you leave it there. And then next time an enemy unit that's within 20 inches activates, you can say, okay, I'm going to try to make an initiative test there. And then you're going to roll against the initiative of that particular unit there. And if you succeed, then your unit, then you'll take and turn this marker to another action. So maybe they get to shoot like an Overwatch or something, or they'll charge back in. If you do choose to do a run and charge a unit after an ambush, you have to charge the unit that was being activated. Otherwise, you can operate and do whatever. I could shoot at a different unit if I wanted. But again, you got to pass your initiative test there. That's ambush. And the other thing here is rally, which is somewhere on this dice. Here we go, rally. And this is a way that you can start to try to remove pins off your die. So when you do rally, you're then going to roll and remove D6 plus 1 pins from yourself, which could come in very useful because you may be on the verge of breaking, which I'll talk about when we get into combat here. And then also, any of your friendly units that are within 10 inches, when you do a rally, they can also effectively do a rally as well. So you can kind of rally other units around you. Even if you don't have pins on a unit, you can do a rally with this unit to try to, you know, bubble and get another unit that, you know, maybe they've already activated and they've taken a boatload of pins, and you're trying to help them out and get them off their feet. So anyway, that's all the different actions, except now we're going to talk about charging, which you're going to do from a run. So let's say we assign a run here. We've got enough to move in, and then we're going to just bump these up and just push all this stuff forward. You just have to be within the distance to get your closest model touching their closest model. There's no like range on the melee weapon, so if this was how it's sort of lined out, even though this guy's probably like 3 or 4 inches away, you're still going to count the entire unit against each other in combat because it's very fluid, right? And then what you're going to do is, if anybody has any ranged, you're going to make ranged attacks, and both sides can do this, but it's going to be at -1 because you're sort of flying, you know, against each other in combat, so you're really scared. And so you're going to make ranged attacks back and forth. Remember, if you get any hit at all, you're going to get a pin. So each side, let's say they both had ranged, they're going to get a pin on them. And then you maybe remove any casualties that you do there. But again, no matter how many casualties you remove, I don't know if I was clearing that before, it's just 1 pin if you take a hit on ranged. So maybe he goes away. And then you're going to simultaneously again go into melee combat. Now it is worth noting that after melee combat and sometimes after shooting, you have to do a break test. Now you have to do a break test if you lost half or more of your models in a shooting round, whatever that may be. It could be from a charge or just a normal fire. And then after a round of combat, somebody's going to be doing a break test. So we'll talk about break tests in a second, but let's do combat. So again, you're going to roll dice and try to, in this case, to beat your strength number or get under your strength number. Now the charging unit is going to get +1 strength. So let's say these guys are 5 strength, these guys are 5 strength, but they have +1 because they charged. So they'll be trying to get under 6s. The other side will be trying to get under 5s. You take the hits, you assign the hits. Maybe you assign the orange die to your leader because they've got tough, which means they can re-roll if they miss that resilience roll. You roll the resilience roll. In this case, for each wound or removed model that you take, then you're going to get a pin. So let's say we lost 2 guys here and they get 2 pins, so they're up to 3, and these guys only lost 1. Whoops. And so they got a pin there. Then the side that won that combat, and the way that you tell who won is whoever has the least amount of pins. In that case, then that side can choose, in this case it would be the Ghost Riders, to have a second round of combat. And then you would do the same thing again, rolling per the models that were left. And then at that point you can't have any more. You only have maybe 2 rounds of combat back to back. And then the side that ends up losing, let's say we don't want to do that, so we let them take a break test because they're losing. They're again going to roll against command. This number here, 7 or 8 if the leader's in present. And then you're going to subtract whatever pins they have from their command. And if they break, in this case, on a break test, whether that's from shooting, getting mangled and shooting or this, they're going to roll D6 and add that many pins to them, which could then, let's put them over their command. So if you ever get pins over your command, then the unit just goes and they run away. It's like battle shock, right, in Sigmar. So you just blow everything away and that unit's gone. Or if they have, let's say, a little bit less, in this case they only have 6, then they have to route. And they will turn and run towards their starting edge of the table, wherever they came from, one of their movements. So they're going to turn and run here, like so, like that, and they'll move, 5 inches away. Now at this point, you can't be within 1 inch of another unit. And that's a rule that goes throughout the game. It's kind of a 1 inch bubble unless you do a charge like we just did. But let's say they didn't route right here. And then at that point, starting with the unit that was kind of mangled, then they would have to move away anywhere, doesn't matter which direction, and move away from the combat here up to their movement. And they got to be at least 1 inch away from everybody else. And then the other one could do that here. And maybe they kind of like, oh, we'll consolidate over here and maybe try to attack this group a little bit later. So that's the gist of that, of the combat. Now, there's a lot of extra, like obviously granularity and stuff with different units. Like this is a mounted unit, or excuse me, a monstrosity unit. It's got crew and stuff, so it's got ranged attacks. It's a monstrosity, so instead of taking wounds or losing models, then instead, whenever you take a wound on this, you'll roll on a monster damage table. So if you roll a 10 there, that'll just delete it. But other things will happen, and a lot of these monsters units, they have what's called mod 2, so you actually can assign them 2 dice over the course of the turn, so they could like run twice or run and shoot and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of little ways of playing with this. This particular unit has these lances, so when they charge in, they have what's called a strike value on a charge, where it's like an armor rend, so they will subtract 3 from the resilience of the target unit there. And so there's a lot of little things like that. Now there's also magic, which you roll a d10. There's a list of spells, and you can pretend this guy's a wizard here. He can take 1 spell for free. He can bump up his magic level. He can take another one for more points, another magic spell. Some spells will be like your wizard's level plus a d6, and that will do whatever effect, like damage or add pins or heal or whatever, or bring units back if you're undead. So there's a lot of little keywords and things like that. Let's look at a summary of special rules here. So these are just a list, a few pages long, of special rules, and the different armies and stuff will have more or less, different things. Like the undead army has the zombie master rule, where the zombie guy or the necromancer can buff up zombies with their command ability, which normally the zombies can't do that unless you spend the points. And then like these guys all can do that. The only last thing, there's 7 scenarios in the book. Most of the scenarios, the outcome is going to end up being whoever loses more than half of their units first loses. So that's called your army like basically breaking. And so even though there are some scenarios here that are objective based scenarios, like try to get to certain buildings and burn them down and stuff like that, I've found that most of them just turn out to be whoever ends up, demolishing the other guy faster. So just wanted to do a quick kind of flip through. That was kind of the gist of the book. Let's just take a look here. I found that the rules are very well written, very clear. There's a lot going on, and it's pretty dense. They get you kind of into your basics here and so on. There's one thing I wanted to make sure. This was kind of a misprint. They left this section out of the movement section. And so make sure that when you get the book, you get this little bit too. It is relatively important. And what it says is if you assign a run marker to a unit that is also fast, and remember that this unit here is a fast unit, then you can decide to leave that marker with that unit. And then at the next round, then everybody that has a run marker next to one of their fast units, you can only do this with fast ones, they can go ahead and activate all of those units before we start pulling out of the bag. And so that makes for some interesting things. You have a unit that runs up and then they stay running, and then you need to say, oh, you know what? I'm going to turn this to an ambush. So go ahead and do something, because then I'm going to react. And I know I can probably try to do that if I get my initiative roll. So you want to make sure you have this in there. And it goes through some pretty interesting stuff, talks about moving through terrain and all that kind of stuff, rolling for agility, goes through all the special rules. Like I said, here's chariots. These are kind of like the monstrosities where you roll in a damage chart and stuff, and there's some different things to kind of account for the crew and stuff like that. Here's all the special rules, which are pretty straightforward. Like I said, having Battle Scribe makes this easier to build the armies. And they talk about your terrain, playing the game, how to kind of set up for deployment and choosing the sides, deciding how many points you want to play, all that stuff. There's 7 scenarios, and there's a whole bunch of army list stuff here in the back. You can use whatever miniatures you want. They give you a bunch of miniature companies here in the back that you might want to investigate and then pull from. Everything's 28 millimeters. So as long as you say, well, he's got a lance, so we're using the lance thing, and just keep it clear, everything's good. And then there's the kind of the quick reference stuff, which is very handy. You can get these off their website in PDF form. So if you're like, oh, I've got a javelin, what does that do? So there's not like a ton of different things, but there is like a lot of crunchy stuff to sort of point out. And as you build stuff up, it's a little bit more like 40K in that way versus Age of Sigmar, where you have different size units and add a single model to a unit or take it away, and then add, different weapons. It's not just all like baked into a war scroll. There's a lot of variety here and ways to kind of break things up. But that kind of gives you an overall gist, I think, of the game. Okay, so that was Warlords of Erehwon, or I'm just going to call it Warlords of Nowhere. Let's talk about kind of the 3 pillars of reviews. So first is like playtime and player count. Well, this is obviously just a 2-player only game, although I don't think there's any rule specifically for doing a 3 or 4 player game, but there's nothing really stopping you from doing that either. Definitely you could play like 2 versus 2 on teams, and each team take like 2 500-point armies and then go in together. And then as far as playtime goes, the 500-point game, if you're going to play that, it's going to be pretty quick. You're going to be done in less than an hour. I would say if you do the full or kind of normal or regulation 1,000-point army, that probably will only go about 2 hours maybe. Like I said, all the games that I've played of it have ended in one side or the other breaking. I've never seen anything go past, I think, turn 3. Typically, I think it goes to 5 or 6 depending on the scenario, or maybe that's open-ended depending on the scenario as well. So I think you're at most in for like a 3-hour game if you had a really knockdown drag out, although that would be a lot of fun, because then it would be really close and right down to the wire. And then the last pillar of reviewing is sort of what is it like? Well, like I kind of said at the beginning, I was very interested to try this because of the bolt action system where you're pulling dice and the turns are more, iterative actions. The name of the mechanic is escaping me. Instead of I go, do all my stuff, move all my units, shoot them all, fight them all my magic, and then you go and do all your stuff like Warhammer does, it's more, alternating activations, that's the word, like a kill team or some other games like that are smaller games usually, or like Frostgrave. So this is alternating activations, but you don't really know, what order you're going to do things in. And a lot of times you don't necessarily want to like activate all your units at once, because then you are waiting for then the opponent to get all of this reaction back to you. So you might think, oh, it's going to be lucky because maybe one turn Billy gets all the dice and they get to do all their stuff right away. Well, that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's going to kind of depend. And that's really going to inform your decisions when you're like, okay, well, I could run this up there, but then maybe I get jumped by like 5 of their units and then just delete my unit off the board. So that inherent kind of uncertainty is going to hopefully make you play a little bit more cautiously. And I really enjoy that. And I really like how the order that you give it kind of hangs around for a little while and still kind of informs kind of other stuff reacting to it. So it makes it start to feel a little bit more visceral instead of like, I move this, and instead of it being kind of like chess-like, because you kind of have that implication of like, well, I ran this fast unit, which means if you shoot at it, it's going to be harder to hit. Or because, like I talked about at the end of the walkthrough, maybe I ran a fast unit and then I flipped it to ambush at the next round, because you can kind of leave that marker laying around, and it allows you to sort of deal with that. Or if you have like a down unit, you know that, okay, well, maybe that's a little bit more vulnerable to, they've got a lot of pins on it or something like that. So I really enjoy the mechanics and how you break down the army as well. Because a lot of times I'll get on forums, I'll just be honest with you, and a lot of people will kind of gnash their teeth about Age of Sigmar and stuff like that, which I love. I absolutely adore that game. But they're like, I want a crunchier rule set. Like, I missed old fantasy and stuff, which I never played, so I don't really care about that. But, like, I want a real big, crunchy, meaty rule set to kind of, get my teeth around and have some extra dimensions of realism and stuff like that. And I kind of think like this kind of does that. Because you have some like real easy to learn stuff. I mean, I didn't really talk about line of sight and all that kind of stuff, but the way they do line of sight is really cool. We're just measuring base to base. And if you're assigning the hits to the models, if these other models are behind cover, then you can't assign hits to them because you can't see them. So maybe you just dump a bunch of hits on these 2 that are peeking around the corner and stuff like that. So, but it kind of takes care of a lot of that sort of crunchy realism stuff that folks want when they play a larger wargame stuff, but does it in a way that I think is intuitive and not overwhelming. And it's done in a way that is sort of universal across most of the armies. And it's kind of like more armies will have more or less of different special abilities and rules that you kind of just tack onto that same core. So all the core stuff, we know what we're doing. You're rallying, okay, you're doing this, you're doing that. And then because your unit is a certain way, you'll get different cool benefits, and where you kind of start layering all the fantasy stuff in on top of that core bolt action stuff. Yeah, so the spells are interesting. This is what I would say. If you're going to get into this and you want to have like the best game possible of it, in my opinion, you should probably build your army in such a way. I would say you want 1,000 points worth, because the 500 game is just for learning, in my opinion. The only real rule is that you have to have a warlord unit. So usually that's just one special character, and then they have like a little bodyguard contingent. And then everything else, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So you could just build no, you can't have more than one wizard, I don't think, either. But in some of the monstrosity units, you can only have one of those, but other ones you can have more of. I would say this is what you want to do, and you don't have to have a wizard either. So, long story short, you need your warlord unit. I would say you want 1 wizard. You want 1 monstrosity maybe, but I would not allow more than 1 monster or monstrosity unit, because you can kind of get abusive with that and just have like a bunch of like, there's 1 carrion beast in the undead thing, which flies and throws these giant rocks, and there's no limit on them. So I would say you only really want 1 monster, 1 big unit. The warlord, 1 magic user, 1 wizard. You want to have a wizard because you can then dispel their spells and stuff like that, and it just gives you a little bit more range and tactility and some other like tools to kind of augment and buff up your units, which makes it fun and makes it more fantasy. And then the last thing you want is some range, because I talked about in the walkthrough, you want to start peppering the opponent with pins, because that's how you're going to get them to break and roll in the command and fail their commands and all that stuff. And so then you get some really interesting stuff. So you have some melee units, some ranged units, maybe a monster here, and then a wizard, and of course the leader. So you need a leader, you want a wizard, you want some range, and you want a monster, or maybe both players don't use a monster. Because the monsters can be pretty tough, but the cool thing is, the other thing I like about this game is the D10 system. And it's very, very different to the rolling the massive D6. Sometimes you roll a massive D10s, like say you get a unit of 10 and they beef up to 2 attacks each, you're rolling 20 D10s. but the units never get too large. You're not rolling like a gigantic bucket of dice. And they'll be fighting something like, let's say this happened in a game where I had a unit of 10 zombies, which were like the weak zombies. You can get like kind of an upgraded zombie. They were the weak, dumb zombies. 10 of those little weenie zombies against the mammoth. And the mammoth has a resilience of 12. Okay, so the only way the mammoth is going to fail is if you're able to rend down his resilience down to like a 9, still really high. So basically, the only way the mammoth is going to take a hit is if he rolls a 0 on defense or a 10. And so we had one game where they were going to lose anyway, the undead, but they killed the mammoth because they got a bunch of hits in. So he had to roll like, I don't know, 6 or 7 resilience dice because they got lucky on the roll. And he got, I think, only 1 0 in there. So that one got through. And then he's a large unit. So when he fails, he doesn't take wounds or pins or anything. Well, take a pin, but he doesn't take any wounds or deletes himself. And then he rolls a 10 on the monster table, so the zombies ate him and he's gone. So even though it's really hard, it's still possible to beat this thing. And so when that does happen, it's like a really kind of dramatic big moment. It's like, whoa, the zombies, they ate him. You know, they ate that giant elephant. And so just because of that D10 system, it's just a really kind of different, interesting way for me that plays a lot of Sigmar to kind of, you know, go through the battles and stuff and kind of see kind of the outcome of how these, you know, clashes interact and everything. So I like that choice is there. And there's other couple little smart things I really like. I like how the magic works and the range, and, you know, the whole pin system is really neat because a lot of times you've got, you know, a couple of models and you only lose like 1 or 2 models, but then those pins build up and then there's all of a sudden your unit's gone. So it's in that whole game, and that sort of interesting kind of chess match with that is cool. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. The only thing I would kind of say, and I kind of alluded to this in the walkthrough part of it, is every game, like I said, has come down to one side breaking versus the other. Now, there's been some games that have been more lopsided, and that's just because building armies and not knowing what we're doing. The other side is, you know, they've been close games, but I would like to see some more like objective-based outcomes in the game. And I don't know, this is why I'm a little hesitant here, as I don't know if necessarily is that just because I don't know what I'm doing, you know, and we're just kind of playing the game and learning it. It could be that. But having played some of the scenarios where there's an objective, like go burn the house or go find the relic and that stuff, and then it still comes down to just, oh, well, you killed more of my stuff on turn 3, so I automatically lose. You know, you could easily house rule that and just say, okay, well, that's no longer the victory condition. Now, that's like the basic victory condition, and the scenario will only override that if that doesn't happen. It's a very easy house rule to say, well, remove that, and the only victory condition is the scenario. And I feel like, I'm not sure, but I kind of feel like we might just have to do that and just say, okay, screw that rule. We're just going to play, because the scenario objective is the thing. That's the important thing. We're not all going to run away just because we lost half our units. You know? So that's my only kind of real quibble with it. And again, I really don't know if it's just because I don't know what I'm doing. The other thing is, 2 things I wanted to mention that are very interesting kind of outcomes of this that I didn't expect. I know I'm kind of rambling here. The bolt action system has 2 interesting side effects that are good. One is that you can pick up and leave the game and pick it right back up without worrying about it. Because all you got to do is like, oh, we're starting to play again. Whose turn was it? I don't know. Draw the dice out of the bag. That's whose turn it is. So you could play for like an hour and a half and be like, oh, we got to go eat dinner. We got to go do this. Got to run an errand. Then you just come back, and 2 weeks later, and then you just start, oh, whose turn is it? I don't know. Pull the dice out of the bag. There you go. Start playing. You know, the giant D6 is on round 2, so I guess we're on round 2. And then we keep playing. So that's really cool. You can just stop, like, not even like in between a turn. You can stop like mid-turn. It's like, oh, we got to go. Resolve this combat. Okay, good. They flee, gone. And then we go, we come back, we're good. All right. That's cool. I really like that. That's neat. The other thing is it makes it very easy to solo, because instead of like trying to surprise your opponent necessarily, although there still is that, you can just play it back and forth, which is something I love to do with the lock and load system for the World War II games and things. Is you just kind of draw a chit and you're like, oh, well, that's going to be this unit. And I'm going to say, well, what would they do? what was the best thing that they could do? Well, I know that he could do this and this guy could do that, and so I do that, and then we'll see what happens. I don't know what they're going to do next because they might not even pull a die next. So it's actually a very soloable, somewhat large-scale war game, which I get asked a lot of. You know, some people might laugh and say, well, it's sad that they would want to play this solo, which drives me a little crazy, but that's more on the person making that comment than anything else. But I do get a lot of questions about like, hey, how easy is it to solo Age of Sigmar? And it's like, well, you kind of can. I always answer you could, because there's not really a lot of hidden information in Age of Sigmar or even 40K. Sometimes there is. It kind of depends how you play it and what if you have like cards and like, I don't know. It's pretty soloable, but this is really soloable because there's nothing really hidden. You just draw the die. You draw the die and go, what's the best thing I could do with this die? And just kind of close yourself off to that and think about some of the permutations, do the action, draw the next die. And then you can kind of solo through it. So that's really cool for somebody that if you want to like practice the game, which I've done quite a bit of the last couple of weeks. So anyway, that's an interesting thing. So that, I definitely recommend this game. If you've got a bunch of Age of Sigmar models, old Warhammer models, or other games, I love this stuff where you can go and get a book like Frostgrave or whatever else. And you get a book, you're like, I have all these miniatures. I'm kind of bored of Sigmar. I'm kind of bored of 40K or whatever. Like, I want to do something different. I have all these models. I spent all this time painting them. Let's use them and do this stuff with it. And then you're like, oh, you know, it'd be really cool if I could take a Chaos Dwarf army and take the Arcanaut frigate and pull that in there, and then I could base them cool. Oh, that's sweet. Now I can just build new stuff with like random stuff that I threw together and combine armies and do different things because it's really open-ended. A lot of the armies are just like, these are the knights, these are the undead, these are barbarians. I play the ogres as the barbarians, and obviously my ghosts and stuff is the undead. But you could just say I've sort of theory crafted, what was it, beast. There's a beast army, like a beastman army, and I'm like, well, I'll just play my corn army with that, whatever. I just give them the stats, and okay, these reavers, these are just the warriors, and these little bloodletters, those are like the guard or whatever they're called, because they're a little bit more beefy and stuff. And then you just play with it, and it's like, these are the guard, these are whatever, let's go. Doesn't matter. So there you go. I would say definite must buy. If you've got a bunch of fantasy miniatures laying around, you got to get this. It's definitely worth it. There's a lot to sort of chew on it and gnaw through, with the one kind of caveat there about the objective-based stuff, which I'm not really sold on isn't necessarily a problem. I may not know. So anyway, definitely take a look at Warlords of Nowhere, or Nowhere Hammer. No Warhammer. All right, bye.